Hey, what's up everyone, and welcome to this week's installment of the Fabricator Series Segments, where every single week I upload one more chapter, sometimes two, of how to build a tube chassis front end, which is demonstrated on this S13. So, if you are not subscribed already to the Fabricator Series YouTube channel, absolutely go down right now and push that button so you don't miss the next week's uploads. If you're not familiar with the Fabricator Series, head over right now or after this video to the fabricatorseries.com, and there you'll find the build blogs on how to build a tube chassis front end, where each week there will be another episode posted, and in there you can get onto the discussion of everything, ask questions, talk about it amongst everybody else, and all kinds of other good stuff. There's also a lot of great stuff for you to learn while you're over there. You can also check up on facebook.com/thefabricatorseries. There's always another upload, another update, something else going on, and I'm also a big fan of Instagram, so head over to Instagram at the.fabricator. Check all the information below here, and I'll have all of that there. If you need to get a hold of me, send a message, drop a comment, drop me an email, do whatever you gotta do, and I always try to get back to you. So without any further delay, here's this week's episode of how to build a tube chassis front end. Company, and maybe you've noticed the shirt that I've been wearing called I Heart Gussets has actually contacted me and said, how would you like to save a little time when it comes to making all of your dimple die gusset panels and fabrication pieces and whatnot? And I said, well, sure, I love to save time because making these videos I always run on a very tight timeline. So they sent me over one of their sample packs of 3 of their top selling models of gusset plates. And you know, as far as I know and what they've told me and what experience I have with them so far is they're cut out of structural steel. It looks to be probably about A36 if it's structural steel. That's most likely what it is. I didn't confirm it with them, but I'm just going to guess. It's all laser cut, and they're just absolutely sexy because they're all very, very uniform and unique. So I said, well, you know what? Let's see what I can do with one of them. So this piece right here, which is a cut to width, I found it's actually going to fit perfectly on the top section between the tube and the outer area of the main chassis where we cut it off before. And this will actually be really great to bolt the fender to. So I'm going to give these a shot, see if it's something I'll endorse, but it's looking right now like I'm definitely going to start using these in the future. So this is what I have in mind here. I like to put this filler panel in here about halfway over the tube, and leave these dimples up top here to kind of expose what's going on underneath. I think that'll look pretty cool. But we definitely need to get this side here squared up and cut evenly, and then fill this piece in before we can add the panel there and trim that to fit. So I'm just going to use my square, pretty good guide here, and mark this off right here where I want to cut and how much I want to cut. And that'll square it off nice and even. So it'll be really simple here. I'll just grab my Sawzall. So I'll just meander around here, grab a piece of just some sheet metal, trace that out, something like that. Using scraps on the ground is kind of convenient. That way you don't have to, I've seen a couple people do it, you just grab a big old piece and you're like, oh, I need to measure this out. No, just pick it up off the ground, find a nice piece in there. And I'll go ahead and straighten that out a little bit. Flatten it down. Pretty close fit. Now when you're running these little tiny tack fillers, those really quick sporadic ones, it kind of puts a ball on the end of the wire, so when you zap it again, it fills it up really quick. Now it's best to have a very responsive welder in order to do that, but usually just about any one of them will do. So Get this trimmed off nice and clean like. I'm going to trim this around. I'm going to put a few more welds on the inside here to strengthen it up, and then we'll cut a piece here to kind of fill all this in here. Let's just work on this filler real quick. I think I'm going to, yeah, I'll just line it up at the bottom here. I'll trace the top out. It's a little more accessible, a little easier to get to. That looks pretty good. I think I can agree with that design. Cut it out. So let's get some tacks on here. And the only reason I'm using 18 gauge is because this is not really meant to take care of any structure or anything like that. It's capped off and all the structure has basically been transferred over to the primary tube. So this is just a filler cap. Almost missed on that one. There we go. Essentially a stitch weld. I'll end up grinding that one down in a minute. So now that it's all welded up, I'm going to let it cool just a few minutes, and then we're going to grind it and make it nice and pretty and all flush. Alright. So what I'd like to see here is this cover about half of the tube here, which is about there. I'm going to mark here, and I'm going to just kind of extend the line here, because I have to notch this section out right here. And we'll take a measurement. So we'll take this measurement. Looks like it's about, oh, that's about 3/4 of an inch. So I'm going to mark back 3/4 of an inch here. And here. Just kind of run it over there. Do a rough cut. And that'll look about like that. Now, this is structural steel, so it's going to be just a little bit more difficult to cut through with the snips due to the heat treatment. But, it's like I say all the other times, we'll just get strong, grab the snips, and get this cut out. Let's see how well it fits. Pretty close, pretty close. So I'm going to take the grinder here and I'm just going to kind of contour this, notch it out a little bit, and then it'll fit in there just right, just where I want it. Alright, let's see. That's pretty close to being workable. Just a couple little tacks on here. Just to kind of hold it in place for a moment. Alright. That'll look real sharp. Nice and clean. Well, that pretty much wraps up this side of everything we got to do. So now we're going to start bending some more tubes and get the rest of this front end finished. Alright. So we actually have a bit of a design change. And that design was based on a conscious and practical decision by the owner, and kind of myself at the same time to help out and persuade on that decision. The car right now is in the design stages and it's not really ready to go full race car, but after this, of course, it's a lot closer. So we haven't made the decision yet on exactly which engine we're going to run, or he's going to run in the future, or its aspiration, whether it's going to stay naturally aspirated or forced induction. So not exactly sure which way it's going to go. So for right now, we're not going to run the intercooler. And since we're getting rid of the intercooler, we don't need to V-mount And since we don't need a V-mount and we don't have an intercooler, we can put the AC back in, because this is going to be a practical daily driver, still with the tube front end and all the rest of the stuff on it. So for right now, we're going to revert back to the original style. And even though I originally engineered and designed this entire tube front end to work with the V-mount system, we did catch it in a certain amount of time to where I could change this up. And even in the future, with the design that I'm using now, or the changes that I did make to it, we can literally cut this whole front section out here and then still build, let's say, a V-mount or a different design, or even take the AC out and put an intercooler in, for example. I mean, there's a few different things that can be done still or in the future. And I'm going to leave it open and available and able to, be changed up in the future. So right now, this side is completely finished. The tub is in, of course, welded. The 1-inch tube work that I used to run the iHeart Gussets plate, the whole bucket, the headlight assembly, everything, all of that is still in, is now in, and we're ready to go on that one. So since this side is done and I haven't shown you how to do it yet, we're going to move over there. So get this side done here, and then we're going to finish off this upper core support and work on the whole nose front end here. So first things first, let's get this side set up. Alright, so one of the more difficult things with this build is, if you've noticed up to this point, is rather than follow instructions, like building a roll cage or whatever the case is, this is a little bit more complicated because it's more about picking a point in space and following it. You have to try to imagine all of this and actually figure out where to measure from in a space where nothing is. And of course, this side is not going to be a whole lot different. Because if you notice, we have no bracketry anymore for the headlight bucket to sit on, so now we've got to figure out exactly what it is we're going to do and where we're going to stick everything. That's kind of difficult, but at the same time, not very hard to do if we just follow some really, really simple points here. So what I'm going to do is take my headlight bucket here. I'm just going to hold it up, and I'm not really all that concerned about the gap here, the spacing. But I am more concerned about the contour on this front end of this nose. I want to make sure that this contour of this fender gradually comes in and lines up to the top of the headlight, or the headlight cover here. I want to make sure that this doesn't, stick out right here or sit all crooked or leave a really funny looking gap. I want it nice and even like. So I'm just going to kind of hold it up here and visualize about where it's going to land. And if we notice here, I'm going to look at the top and versus the bottom here. I notice that the tab from the headlight bucket itself goes further inward. Right now it sits a little bit underneath this iHeart Gussets dimple die panel. So I'm going to set this up on top here and try to line this up again. And I need to create a bit of a visual reference. So I'm just going to make a mark here directly on the dimple die panel. Set my bucket aside here. With that mark, I have a visual reference of where that tab on the headlight bucket needs to land, or where it needs to sit. So what I need to do is find out if my tube will fit in there. Okay. Now, of course, I already did this on the other side, but this is just showing you how it's actually done, or how it's figured out here. So I know that if I hold this is my 1-inch tube cheater. If I hold a section of 1-inch tubing up inside of here, I know that it's going to slide right under there and everything will be copacetic and everything will fit per this line. We still have enough for that bracket to come in here, not hit the tube, and we can weld the tabs onto the bottom of it. So everything's great in that aspect. We're gonna make this one work. So what I'm going to do now, since I have the design in mind, what I really need to do is have some inside support for the iHeart Gussets dimple die panel, and that's also going to help support the fender. So that's the whole significance of this 1-inch tube here. Aside from holding the headlight in place and creating the mount for the headlight bucket, it needs to support on the inside of this panel right here. It needs to help support the fender and tie in the rest of the chassis. So let me get this fender off and out of here, and then we'll start measuring and cutting everything. Alrighty, so with the fender off, let's run over our design real quick. We need a tube to run to the outside, run down along the outside of the iHeart Gussets dimple die plate. It's going to hang an angle right here, which we need to figure out which angle that is. It's going to slide in between this dimple hole and this line right here, which signifies the point at which our headlight bucket will slide into. This is the top of the headlight bucket tabs. There's like a bolt here, and then there's a little one further down. Once it transitions over here, it then becomes the top section, or serve as the mount for the headlight bucket itself. And then it's going to hang what looks like a 90 and go right down to the main chassis rail. Of course, we're going to have to measure out in where on this it's going to have to land, of course, because that side's already done, and we're going to measure from the end here to make sure that this lands on the exact same side so that they're both equal. Right, so we did verify that the tube will slip in between this dimple hole and this line here, which is the top of the headlight bucket tab. Everything's good there. So what we need to do first is set our cheater up. And what I'm going to do, I have this marked out, of course, the beginning of the bend, which is notched, and of course I have it marked out the beginning of the bend at the die and the beginning of the bend itself when it starts its deformation in the die itself. So I have both of those marked out. I'm going to slide it underneath here, and I'm going to kind of hold it up in place here to give myself an idea of how much tubing I need. I'm going to put both marks here, and I know which one is which. So I'm going to measure from this outside line here to here, and that's going to tell me how much excess tubing I need outside of the bend, which in this case, about 14.5 inches. I'm going to set it back up in here, same spot again. And luckily I can see right through that dimple hole right there, and I can see where my notch starts. Maybe you can or cannot in this take here, but if you can't, you can absolutely trace it from the bottom side and then translate your line to the top side, but I can actually see it right here through this hole, so I'm going to make a mark. This right here signifies the beginning of this bend. Okay. Now we need to figure out at what angle that sits at. So I'm going to measure along here, and I'm going to kind of sight this. It needs to be perpendicular to the main chassis rail. So I'm going to set this up here, kind of give a good look. Now I'm ignoring this line here because this obviously wasn't squared or anything like that. I'm just looking to make sure that I have it perpendicular to that chassis rail. As I look here, I see it down there. That says 95, but it's actually, if we were to go backwards here, it's actually 85 degrees. So this bend number 1, 85 degrees. Now this notch right here obviously signifies the beginning of the first bend. Now we're going to hold it up, kind of place it along with the chassis here, where it's going to land on that chassis, on that main chassis rail. Take a measurement, stick it in the notch on my cheater. As I hold it there, right in the place that it needs to be, from that notch in the cheater, which signifies the beginning of the bend, to this section right here, where I just marked on the I Heart Gussets dimple die panel, 6.5 inches in between each bend. So I'm going to write it down right here, 6.5. Now the last thing that we need to figure out is our offset angle. Now you notice that this has a downward grade to it, and of course if this cannot be parallel with the main chassis rail below. So if it was, we would, easily just bend our first 90 degrees and then clock at 90 degrees and then bend 85 degrees, and that would work out. Except this has a downward gradient of 10 degrees. So when we bend our tube, we're going to have to offset it or turn it inside of the die to only 80 degrees and not 90 degrees when it comes to clocking. Now we'll go show you how to do all that now that we have all of our dimensions in place. So the idea behind this is to find out how much tubing we're going to use when it wraps around and actually gets bent into the die. Okay, so we know where we can calculate where it's going to start, we can actually mark out where it's going to finish, but how much of that tubing do we actually use when it went into the bend? So the first thing that we're going to do is find out how much tubing we need in order to feed it into the bend. So I'm going to measure from the beginning of the die to the end of it where the actual hole or the tubing stay, bolts on. It's about 4 inches. So we're going to start our bend at 4 inches into the tube. Now I really don't know how much we actually need here, so I'm just going to start marking it out in 1 inch increments. So 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Now I'm going to use the red marker here just to kind of mark out the beginning of the bend. So that way there's no confusion on which side I started bending and which side I ended with. So I'll give that just a moment to kind of dry. Feed it into the bender. Now I'm going to put all of the marks face up so that way they're a little bit easier to see once I have it out. Set it up on the inside of the bender. Now you can see here where the last bit of deformation came from in the actual bend itself. So when we slide this out of here, carefully look here, find out where it stopped. It stopped right about on the outside of this line here. So where the bend actually terminated, about right here. It's about halfway between those two marks. So let's count our marks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. About half. So each time I bend a 90, I lose about 5.5 inches worth of tubing. Alright, so feeding 10 feet of tubing into the bender for that little small section is kind of ridiculous. Very difficult to work with. So we need to cut it down to size. But how much tubing do we actually need? Well, let's actually calculate this and figure it out based on the measurements that we took earlier. Now on the right side, underneath the I-Heart Gusset Dimple Die panel, we needed 14 inches worth of tubing, or it was actually 14.5 to the beginning of the bend. So let's start there. 14.5 inches required. Now I know that each bend, when I bend a 90 inside of my bender, cost me 5.5 inches worth of tubing. Now that was at 85 degrees, but we're just going to run with that 90 degree mark. So we'll add 5.5 inches, brings us up to the 20-inch mark. Now we're up to the front side. Now the front side between each bend we found was 6.5 inches from the start of the bend that goes up or down to the right side to the start of the bend that goes down to the chassis rail. So 6.5 inches, this is to 26.5. Now we need to add the other 90 degree bend that goes down to the chassis rail. That's another 5.5 inches, brings us up to 32 inches worth of tubing. Now, I did not measure how much material or how much excess I need from that point or from the termination of the second bend that goes down to the chassis rail between that and the rail itself. I didn't measure that out, but I'm just going to play safety on this one and know that about 10 inches worth of it, of tubing, is what we need. That brings us up to 42 inches. So 42 inches worth of tubing is a lot easier to work on than, or feed into a bender than 10 feet. So let me cut this down and we'll start bending it up. Alright, so all I have to do at this point is remember which side my bends need to go on. So if this section here, when we measured it out, was 6.5 inches between these two, then the center line is going to be somewhere around here, which we don't really need to know that because we already measured from the outside in. Bend needs to be on this side and on this side. So when we feed it in here, we got to remember which one's which. So let me run this in here, set it up to the beginning of my die. Now this long side over here was 14.5 inches, which runs up the right side of the chassis underneath the I-Heart Gusset Dimple Die panel. So I'm going to preload here, tighten this down a little bit, so I don't want that to sit. Preload and set to 0. This first bend here was 85 degrees, so that's what we're going to run it at. To get our offset correct, we kind of have to visualize where we're at here, okay? So we already made this bend and we identified this as the right side of the car underneath the I-Heart Gusset Dimple Die panel, okay? And we know that when we measured that if we were looking at the car from the side of it, viewing across the engine, we knew that that had a downward slope of 10 degrees, okay? This is the side that we're working on there. So we know that when we have it inside of the bender here, as it comes down, it's going to go right in front, which this section that's loaded in the bender right now would be the front side. Now we know that it has to go downward, and we need to identify which way downward is. So that's depending on whether or not this has to be up or this has to be down. Okay, so inside of our bender, if we were to do it this way and we were looking down upon it, our field of view was from the top, this would go downward, and this would end up going left. That would be for the left side of the car, which is not what we're working on. So this needs to be upward. So we make sure that we have it set correctly. The beginning of our bend is in our die at the right spot. We know that this has to be upward in order for it to go making a downward bend as it comes forward. Okay. So now we need to know which way our offset is. We talked about that 10-degree angle or that slope that goes downward. So does that mean it needs to be clocked this way in the bender, or does it need to be clocked this way in the bender? Okay. So if we were looking at it from the top, if our face was here, looking at it directly, this would be the top side. So does the slope on the chassis go away from your face, or does it go toward your face where it mates up to the top here? The answer is towards your face. So as we set it in here, we're going to get our 10-degree mark, clock it toward our face if we were looking at it from the top. That's at 80 degrees right there. Let me get my wrench on here. Now, if that doesn't make any sense to you at all, you know, I can throw it into another video and, you know, possibly put something together for you to understand it a little bit better. So if it doesn't, drop me a comment, you know, somewhere in there, write me, whatever the case is. So now we have this set up. Preload is set. Let's kick that 90 degrees onto this section of tube here. So this is our bend. If we hold this perpendicular to the ground, we can see where we have our upward angle. And of course, we look at it from all the other angles. We have our 85 degrees here, and there's the I Heart Gussets dimple die panel is here, the headlight will be here, and this section right down here will mount to the chassis rail. Still confused? Let's throw it on the car, I'll show you. All right, let's just set this up on top of here and have a quick look. See where all of my marks are and all the tube angles and everything else like that. Everything looks good. It's actually going to match the other side quite nicely. So definitely an A+ on this bend. So what I'm going to do real quick is, you notice on top, since it sits on the top, we don't have a whole lot of you know, alignment. It's not really correct because it's on top. So what I'm going to do is slide this underneath and let this section over here overhang off of that edge. I'm just going to clamp it down up here to help keep it in place. Now what I want to do is make sure that I get this cut at the right height, because this will change, you know, angle and placement and everything else if it knocks one way or the other. So we set this up again here with this clamp. Now I want to make sure that this protractor reads 0 degrees. At the point where it does read 0, that's the point where I want to cut the base. I want to cut the bottom evenly with the main chassis rail. So I'm going to go slice this off of here real quick, and then we'll do the top end. Alright, let's just set this back in here after the base has been cut. Just kind of get it pretty close to where we need to be here. Now I'm going to look up in this section right here on my line, and I notice that I need to go about an inch rearward, but the lower section seems to be sitting just right. What I'm going to do for safety's sake here to make sure I've got it cut to length correctly is see that this is sitting on 0 degrees, which it is. So that means that my lower section at the main chassis rail is cut to length correctly. So now we're going to work on this section here. Now this does have kind of a tricky angle to it, and of course since this is cut square, there's a big gap here, so we need to make sure that when we cut this off, it is actually at the correct angle to mate up with that matches this and to make everything slide in correctly. So about an inch needs to come off based on this over here. This section needs to be about an inch rearward, but you know, we're only going to take off a little bit here, so I'm just going to mark roughly a ½ inch of that tube off of here, kind of make my line, and I'm going to make sure that I do a parallel cut, or make sure that this line matches the cut that I need in order to mate it up there. So I'm only going to take off a little bit, just this once here. And of course I'm following the golden rule here, is that you can always take metal away, but you can't necessarily put it back on. So take off a little bit at a time here, just shave off a few until we get it set up and lined up just right. So I do have kind of a rather unique angle on here. And I did that on purpose because I want this front end to kind of taper in a little bit. I want this edge at the edge of the tube here to match up with this bash bar when you're looking at it. Even though it's going to be covered by the fender, if he ever takes it off, I kind of want that really awesome, very aggressive look here. So if we line this up accordingly, notice this, all this edge we have to take off of here, and this contour that we have to meet. So what I'm going to do is kind of line this up here on my marks, which are going to be slightly off. But we'll check with our eyeballs and we'll follow the golden rule, of course. So what I'm going to do is just kind of make a nice little trim line in here. Take this off of here, and that's about the line I'm going to need to cut. Okay, so again, I'm only going to take off a little bit, and I'm going to contour this, and I'm going to keep on fit checking until I have it just right, until this matches up exactly where it needs to be. Now to get my rough cuts here, I'm just going to use the double cuts. Now, of course, remember, undercut. Do a quick fit check here. And here you can actually see the significance of undercutting. Because where I have it set up here, where it feels like it's about where it needs to go, that undercut line really put us up where we need to be. So what I need to do is kind of contour this out just a little bit here. I'm going to clamp this here, clamp this one here. And I'm going to grab my marker. I'm going to trace out the center of that tube into this contour. So take a little bit off of that corner. We're going to straighten this out, all of this, where we're actually at. I'm going to undercut this even still slightly, just so that in case anything shifts or moves or changes, it doesn't affect the I Heart Gussets dimple die panel. That way I don't have to cut this off and build a new one. So really any old straight edge will do, as long as you've got one long enough to actually go with where you're trying to get here. But you can actually see here that it's kind of goes a little wobbly here, a little crooked line. So what I'm going to do is take the edge of the marker here and just run a line straight down. And when we take this off of here, you can see exactly how much we need to take off. Now it is a little bit difficult to see here, but when you zoom in and you get close enough on it, you really zero in your eyes on where you need to trim it down, you'll nail it. That's a nice, clean, straight edge. Okay, now another one of those things that I say repeatedly all the time when it comes to getting this just right, you want to take your time on it. You want to let the flat disc do the work, not your muscles. Now we're going to set it up to get it welded in. Here we go. I'm going to start with the top here so that way I can swing and move and tweak it around just a little bit. So get a solid tack up top. Surprisingly, it looks like we actually got it where we needed it. Let me grab my protractor. Make sure I'm on zero. We're good to go. I'm going to drop a tack down here on the bottom. Okay. I'm going to zero this down one more time. Make sure that my angles are correct. I'm going to tack it up right here. Right in the middle. We'll tack it up right here on the edge. good there. Still on our marks there, so look at the rest of this tacked in here. Now, you probably noticed a couple of times here that there's been a lack of use of the TIG, and the reason why is most of this is for aesthetics. I mean, of course, obviously all of these individual tacks, they do hold the chassis together, they hold the sheet metal on, and everything's fine. There's no concerns there as far as structure and safety is concerned. I'm actually chasing a certain look here, so these large tack welds, or these large spot welds here, kind of create a much better look, or a really aggressive kind of race car style to it. I mean, it's just, you can get artistic with it, but the TIG itself, if you were to sit there and try to puddle that up and build it up, it would take a while to do. So in the interest of saving time, since there is no difference as far as strength and whatnot is concerned, I'm just using the MIG for all these really awesome little spot welds here. So that helps kind of decorate the chassis a little bit. It makes it look really cool. So I'm going to get the rest of these on and try to make it match the other side. There's a bit of a lip on here. Just takes a little bit of working. Right here in the center. Awesome. With everything welded up, cooled down just a little bit, we can start putting this fender back on here. And the reason why is we need it to be set in place while we mount up the headlight. So I'm just going to get this screwed down here. Now this can be a little tricky if you don't have anybody to help out, but you just pretty much take a set of locking pliers and see if you can get your gap set just right. And what we need to do is at least get one tab just right. Now you notice here that this is definitely not fitting where it needs to be, so the headlight bucket needs to come forward just a little bit. Or you can move it around, kind of tweak it up a little bit. This gap is just way too tight, so let's try again. We'll basically just keep on moving this one direction or the other until we get it lined up just right. And it only takes a little tiny bit. Now we'll worry about the actual height of it and all the rest of that stuff when it gets down after this is already tacked in, because we can tweak and move them around just a little bit. That fitment's just a little bit better. A little bit more adjustability on that one. So let's see if I can kind of tweak and move this around a little bit. Get our correct fitment, good spot. I'll try and hold this in place here while I get it tacked in. Hopefully I get it just right. That's just a little tack there, so I can move this around a bit. Two hands free. I'll reach up underneath here and see if I can lock this down just a little bit better underneath. just a little bit tricky when you only have 2 hands and nobody else to help. But hey, here you go. You can see how I do it. Maybe you can do the same. You know what? I'm gonna wing it. I'm gonna give that a shot right there. I can cut it back if I need to. See where I land. Pretty close. Let's just take a little bit of, just a little tweak and pull, scoot it around, get it all to line up right. But that'll come a little bit later here. But we're pretty much lined up. We're right where we need to be. So I'm gonna put some heavier tacks down on those. I'm gonna work on the bottom bolts. So with all of our tube work pretty much complete and set in place, we have one more piece that we need to make here, and that's the one that goes down to mount the bottom bolts of the headlight bucket to the front of it. So I'm just going to run a bar going across here, mounts from this tube to this tube, and that's also going to hold in the lower section of the headlight bucket. So I'm just going to take a couple of these I Heart Gussets mounting tabs and set them up in place. Get them both screwed on here. We'll get this set back on. Now at this point, it's actually pretty crucial that we have it lined up correctly. So we're going to take a few extra steps here to make sure that it is actually sitting where it needs to sit, at the correct angle, at the correct height, the correct alignment, correct everything. We need to make sure that it's all right where it needs to be. That's very, very important. Otherwise, the lower tabs might not mount up where they need to be, and the whole alignment of the entire bucket could be way off. So to make sure that we don't end up in that situation, we're going to take a few extra minutes here to take care of some alignment. Okay, so this kind of meets at an awkward angle here, and of course the radius of my tube bender on the 1-inch tube means that it's going to be slightly difficult to actually get this in here. So what I did is I just took a piece of 1-inch tube, stuck it in the die, kicked it off at a 90, and I cut the 90 a little shy of where it actually ends. So I'm going to stick it up, measure it off here, and what I'm looking to do is line it up. The top of the center of the tube is going to mate up with the tab, and that's where I want the tab to be placed. So what I'm basically looking at here is at what point do I terminate this 90 and bring it around. So I'm going to start by notching this out just a little bit, really simple notching, bring it down and get it a little bit closer here, and then we'll work on the inside portion. Now some of this is actually guesswork, but I'm going to start by notching just the top section here, and then we're going to flip it over and notch it again because the tube comes upward or it mates up as it would come down like this. So just do a quick simple notch. With this rough notch, we can go do our fit check real quick and see about how far we are and if we need to cut off more or whatever the case is. So after a little bit of a cleanup here, let's do another fit check, and I've got it fit just quite nicely, and the tab here is just touching the tube. So as it swings around after we cut the inside of it out a little bit and get it notched out to fit the primary tube here, I'll bet you 10 to 1 that this tab is actually going to line up beautifully at the center right where it needs to be. So to make it just a little bit easier here, I'm going to mark out the center of this tube. We're going to take the bucket back off of here and then get to notching the outside section of it, or the right side where it hits the primary tube. So as we get in just a little bit closer here, what I don't want is the tube to terminate at the center of the primary tube. I don't want it over here. I want it actually to be more tangent. I want the tube itself, the outside or forwardmost point of the tube, to be tangent with the forwardmost point of the primary tube. So what I'm going to do first is just kind of mark a baseline here, or a line that references the forwardmost point of the primary tube. And then we're going to go for a throat line, which is about right here. And then I'm going to go diagonal. And then a face line to note that this is the top section of the tube. Now what I'm going to do is make a diagonal cut just straight across right here, and then I'm going to notch this out with a grinder to contour and to mate up to this tube right here. Now much of this actually is kind of dependent on your eyeballs, and that's you know, it's just kind of one of those unique things about doing a tube front end is there's not a whole lot of rules to actually follow with it. You know, much like a roll cage there is, but in this instance there's not. It's really more interpretive or open to your own creative style of it. So this is, you know, again, this is all mated up by hand here, but we'll get this notched out and get it cut right away. So we'll start with our first cut, which is going to be this diagonal here. But what I'm going to do, just to play safety on this one, is I am going to undercut it because we do have to swing it more into where it's at. So if we cut it exactly where it's at right now, it may come up just a little bit short of where we need it to be. So I'm going to undercut. Flat disc, I'm just going to contour this out just a little bit to get it to mate up to that 1.5 inch tube. Alright, let's see where we're at now. So as we line up to our marks, we're pretty much dead on. So what I'm going to do is put the bucket back on here and then check the tab to see where it fits, if it's right where it needs to be. If not, we'll have to try again. This lined up so we can tack our tab. And we'll put a couple more down. Let's see, I'll get one on the inside here. One more for good measure on the tab. And another one on the inside of the tube. Now that's more than enough to be able to pull this off of here and be able to fully weld it. So that's what we're going to get done right now.